My name is Alex Turner, and I've spent most of my life chasing the thrill of discovery. As a spelunker, I've delved into some of the most remote cave systems in the world, always searching for something new beneath the surface. But nothing could have prepared me for the whispering depths. It started with a map, mailed anonymously to my small apartment. The envelope bore no return address, and the map inside was hand-drawn with faded ink. Scrawled across the top were the words, "Discover the depths. Speak with the shadows." A chill ran down my spine, but curiosity quickly overpowered caution. The location marked was a remote area in the Appalachian Mountains, unmapped, untouched, and irresistible. The hike to the entrance was grueling, the trail overgrown with weeds and jagged rocks, but when I reached the cave mouth, it took my breath away. The opening was a perfect oval, surrounded by moss-covered stones that seemed unnaturally smooth. An odd hum, so faint it could have been my imagination, emanated from within. I should have turned back. Instead, I tightened my harness, switched on my headlamp, and descended into the darkness. The cave walls were unlike anything I'd seen before. They glistened as though coated in a thin film of water, yet they were dry to the touch. Strange symbols were etched into the stone, curves and spirals that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt, as though the air itself was watching me. An hour into my descent, I heard it. At first, I thought it was an echo of my footsteps, distorted by the acoustics of the cave, but then I realized it didn't match my movements. It was a faint whisper, so soft it could have been mistaken for the rustling of wind through trees. But there was no wind down here. I stopped, my flashlight trembling in my grip. "Hello?" My voice echoed back at me, distorted and layered, as though it had been repeated by a dozen voices. "Hello," the whisper responded. My blood ran cold. I froze, straining to hear. The whisper continued, faint but unmistakable, repeating fragments of what I had just said but out of order, like a warped recording. "Is anyone there?" I asked. "Is there anyone there?" I turned around, sweeping my flashlight across the cave. Nothing but rock and shadow. The voice, however, grew louder. "Alex," it said. My name. My chest tightened. I hadn't spoken my name. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but a twisted sense of curiosity held me in place. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Are you... who..." The whispers multiplied, overlapping until they were no longer intelligible. It was as though the walls themselves were speaking, reciting words I hadn't yet said. My breathing quickened. The hum I'd heard earlier was back, louder now, vibrating through the soles of my boots. I pressed forward, telling myself that fear was just part of the adventure. That's what I always told myself. But deep down, I knew this was different. Something was waiting for me. Something the map had led me to. The tunnel widened into a massive chamber. My flashlight barely illuminated the far walls, which were covered in those shifting symbols. In the center of the cavern was a pool of perfectly still water, its surface reflecting the light like a mirror. I stepped closer, drawn to it despite every instinct screaming at me to run. That's when I saw my reflection. It wasn't mine. The figure in the water looked like me, same face, same clothes, but its movements didn't match mine. When I leaned forward, it leaned back. When I raised my hand, it stayed still. Its eyes, though, followed mine with a predatory gleam, and then it smiled. "Come closer," it whispered, its voice perfectly clear despite the fact that I hadn't opened my mouth. "No," I whispered back, my voice shaking. It laughed, a low, mocking sound that echoed through the chamber. "You're already closer than you think." The hum in the air grew deafening, rattling the loose stones at my feet. Shadows danced across the walls, shapes I couldn't make out but felt watching me. The pool rippled, though I hadn't touched it, and the reflection began to climb out. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet. The reflection was no longer confined to the water. It stood before me, fully formed. Its smile was too wide, its movements too fluid, as though it were made of liquid mimicking flesh. "Who are you?" I gasped, my voice barely audible. The thing tilted its head, its smile faltering for a moment. "I'm you. I'm what's left when the echoes stop. And you, it said, stepping closer, are my replacement. I scrambled to my feet, backing away toward the tunnel. The creature didn't chase me. It simply stood there watching with a look of pity. You can't run from the depths, Alex. They've already claimed you. I don't remember much about my escape. The whispers followed me through the tunnels, growing louder and more frantic. By the time I reached the surface, the sun had set, and the forest was cloaked in darkness. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing in a clearing miles from the cave. For days, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My reflection in mirrors and windows lingered too long, its movements just a fraction of a second out of sync. Sometimes when I spoke, I thought I heard my words echoed by another voice, faint, but unmistakable. The symbols from the cave appeared in my dreams, shifting and spinning, whispering secrets I couldn't understand. And always, I heard the voice. You're already closer than you think. Months have passed since I left the whispering depths. I've tried to put the experience behind me, to rationalize it as a trick of the mind brought on by isolation and fear. But the evidence is impossible to ignore. Yesterday, I received another envelope, identical to the first. Inside was a photograph of me standing at the entrance of the cave, staring into the darkness. Except I wasn't alone. Standing beside me, smiling with those two wide teeth, was the thing that had crawled out of the pool. This time, the map was scrawled with different words. You're already home. My name is Clara Reynolds, and I've lived in cities my whole life. Concrete jungles, honking cars, and crowded streets defined my world. But last summer, after a bad breakup and a mounting sense of exhaustion, I decided I needed a change. That's how I ended up renting an old farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. It was supposed to be an escape, a quiet retreat where I could clear my head. Instead, it became a nightmare I'll never forget. The farmhouse sat at the edge of a sprawling cornfield, its peeling white paint and sagging porch a testament to years of neglect. It was cheap, though, and the owner seemed almost desperate to rent it out. When I asked why it had been vacant for so long, he shrugged. "City folks don't last long out here," he said. I assumed he meant the isolation, not whatever it was I found. The first few days were blissfully uneventful. The silence was almost oppressive at first. No sirens, no distant hum of traffic, just the rustling of corn in the breeze and the occasional chirp of crickets. I spent my days reading, journaling, and walking along the dirt road that led to the nearest town, about 5 miles away. At night, I sat on the porch, staring at the endless expanse of stars. Then, on the 5th night, the quiet changed. It started subtly. The crickets stopped chirping, and the wind in the cornfield seemed to die. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I noticed something else. Shadows moving through the stalks. They were faint, just barely visible in the moonlight, but they were there. I called out, "Hello? Is someone out there?" Silence. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe, or a stray dog, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there wasn't natural. Still, I locked the doors and went to bed, determined not to let my imagination ruin my newfound peace. The next morning, I found something strange in the field. As I walked along the edge, I noticed several stalks of corn had been bent at odd angles, forming a crude spiral shape. I frowned, crouching to get a better look. The damage wasn't consistent with wind or an animal. It looked deliberate, almost ritualistic. I decided to mention it to the owner when he came by to drop off some supplies. "Kids, probably," he said dismissively. "Or maybe some local pranksters. Don't worry about it." But I did worry. That night I stayed up late, sitting by the window with the lights off, watching the cornfield. Around midnight I saw it again, the shadows moving among the stalks. This time I was sure they weren't animals. The movements were too deliberate, too human. I grabbed a flashlight and headed outside, my heart pounding. "Who's there?" I called, shining the light into the field. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but rows of corn. "I know you're out there." A rustling sound came from somewhere deep in the field, followed by a low, guttural hum. It wasn't a voice, but it wasn't an animal sound either. It was something else entirely. My hands shook as I backed toward the house, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly. I locked the door behind me and stayed up until dawn, every creak and groan of the old house setting my nerves on edge. The next day, I decided to investigate. Armed with a kitchen knife and my phone, I ventured into the cornfield. The sun was high and the warm light made the shadows feel less threatening. But as I walked deeper into the rows, the unease returned. The stalks seemed to close in around me, their dry rustling whispering in a language I couldn't understand. After about 10 minutes, I found it. A clearing in the center of the field. The ground was bare, the corn stalks pushed back to form a perfect circle. In the middle was a crude scarecrow, its body made of rotting wood and burlap, its head a burlap sack with 2 hollow eye holes. But that wasn't the worst part. Pinned to the scarecrow's chest was a photograph. It was a picture of me, sitting on the porch the night before. My stomach turned as I stared at the photo. Someone had been watching me, documenting me. I grabbed the photo and ran back to the house, the sound of rustling corn following me all the way. Once inside, I bolted the door and called the owner. He didn't pick up. I left a frantic voicemail, explaining what I'd found and demanding answers. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room, clutching the kitchen knife. Every light in the house turned on. Around midnight, the lights flickered. Then the power went out. My breath quickened as I sat in the darkness, straining to hear anything over the pounding of my heart. That's when I heard the footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate, like someone testing the creaky boards. "Go away!" I shouted, my voice cracking. The footsteps stopped. A moment later, there was a knock at the door. It was soft at first, almost polite, but it grew louder, more insistent. I backed away, clutching the knife tighter. The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by silence. Then I heard it, a low, guttural hum, the same sound I'd heard in the cornfield. It was coming from inside the house. I don't remember much about what happened next. I ran. I don't even know how I made it out of the house. But I found myself sprinting down the dirt road toward town, the stars above me blurred by tears. The humming followed me, growing louder, more distorted. I didn't stop running until I saw the lights of a diner on the outskirts of town. The police were called, and I told them everything. They didn't believe me. When they went to check the farmhouse, they found no evidence of anyone else being there. No footprints, no scarecrow, no photograph. But the power was out, and several of the corn stalks were bent into spirals just like I'd seen before. I didn't go back. I couldn't. I left everything I owned in that farmhouse and returned to the city, where the noise and chaos felt safe. But the nightmares followed me. In them, I'm back in the cornfield, the scarecrow's hollow eyes watching me as the humming grows louder. And sometimes, late at night, I hear that same hum, faint and distant, as though it's calling me back. My name is Elise Carter, and I've always been drawn to forgotten places. As a freelance photographer specializing in abandoned locations, I've explored decaying mansions, empty hospitals, and silent train stations. I've walked into places most people avoid, and I've never been afraid. That was before Black Hollow. It was a friend, James, who first mentioned the place. "There's an old cabin deep in the woods," he said over coffee one rainy afternoon. "It's been abandoned for decades. They say strange things happen there." I rolled my eyes. "You know I don't scare easily." "You might want to this time," James replied. "The locals say the cabin has a mirror that shows you things you're not supposed to see." Intrigued, I did some digging. The cabin in Black Hollow was rumored to be cursed. Built in the early 1900s, it belonged to the Thorne family, who disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The last owner, Amelia Thorne, was said to have been obsessed with an antique mirror she acquired from Europe, a mirror some claimed was cursed. Locals avoided the cabin, but that only made me more determined to visit. A creepy story and an eerie setting? Perfect for my portfolio. The day I set out for Black Hollow, the woods were drenched in an autumn chill. Orange and red leaves blanketed the forest floor, and the air smelled of damp earth. My GPS failed me halfway there, so I relied on vague directions from James. It took hours of hiking through overgrown trails before I found it. The cabin. The structure was weathered but still standing. Its roof sagged and ivy crawled up its wooden walls, but the sight of it sent a thrill of excitement through me. I pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The cabin was a time capsule. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung from the rafters. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor, and books with crumbling pages sat on sagging shelves. But it wasn't until I reached the bedroom that I found what I'd been searching for: the mirror. It stood against the far wall, tall and imposing, its ornate gold frame gleaming even in the dim light. The glass was unblemished, almost unnaturally so, as if it had been shielded from time's decay. I felt a strange pull toward it, my camera momentarily forgotten. As I approached, I noticed something odd. My reflection didn't quite match my movements. When I tilted my head, the reflection hesitated before copying me. I blinked, stepping back, my pulse quickening. Maybe it was a trick of the light. I spent the next few hours photographing the cabin. The creaking floorboards and occasional rustle of leaves outside were the only sounds. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I passed the mirror, I felt its presence, like it was waiting for something. As dusk settled, I decided to call it a day. But as I packed up, I felt an inexplicable urge to return to the bedroom. The mirror drew me in. My rational mind told me to leave, but curiosity overpowered caution. Standing before the mirror, I hesitated. My reflection stared back, but something about it felt wrong. I reached out, fingertips brushing the cold glass. That's when it changed. The reflection blurred and shifted, like ripples across water. When it cleared, the image staring back at me wasn't mine. It was a woman. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, her lips curled into a chilling smile. She wore a dress that looked like it belonged to another era, and she stood in a place that wasn't the cabin. It was a dark, endless void. I stumbled back, heart pounding. The woman in the mirror tilted her head, mimicking my earlier gesture. Then she raised a hand and pointed at me. I fled the cabin, leaving my gear behind. The sun had set, and the woods were cloaked in shadows. I ran, branches clawing at my arms and face, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. But no matter how far I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. When I finally reached the edge of the forest and saw my car, I felt a moment of relief. I drove home, locking every door and window once I arrived. But sleep didn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, the hollow eyes, the sinister smile, the pointing finger. The next day, I resolved to forget about Black Hollow. I didn't tell anyone what happened, not even James. But strange things started happening. My reflection in mirrors seemed off. It felt like it moved on its own, just out of sync with me. At first, I dismissed it as stress or paranoia. But then I started seeing her. She appeared in mirrors just for an instant, a fleeting image in the corner of my eye. And every time I turned to look, she was gone. It wasn't just at home either. I saw her in store windows, in the glass of my car, even in puddles on the street. The worst was when she spoke. It was late one night, and I was brushing my teeth. As I glanced at the bathroom mirror, I saw her standing behind me. Before I could turn, her voice echoed, low and melodic. "Why did you leave?" I dropped the toothbrush and stumbled back, my chest tight with fear. "What do you want?" I whispered. Her smile widened. "You." Desperation led me back to James. When I told him what happened, his face paled. "You shouldn't have touched the mirror," he said. "They say it's a doorway. She's crossed into your world, Elise." "Who is she?" "No one knows for sure," James said. "Some say it's Amelia Thorne. Others think it's something darker, something that pretends to be her. I couldn't live like this, haunted by a shadow I couldn't escape." James suggested burning the cabin down, destroying the mirror for good. It sounded reckless, but I was out of options. The return to Black Hollow felt heavier, the forest more foreboding. James and I carried a can of gasoline and matches, our footsteps crunching against the leaf-covered ground. When we reached the cabin, it was eerily silent. No birds, no wind, just the creak of the wooden floor as we stepped inside. The mirror was waiting, its glass darker than I remembered. As we poured gasoline over it, I felt a surge of dread. The reflection shifted, and there she was, her hollow eyes glaring at me. "You can't stop me," she hissed. I struck a match, throwing it onto the mirror. Flames engulfed the frame, and a piercing scream filled the cabin. The glass cracked and shattered, and for a moment, I thought I saw her clawing at the void, trying to escape. The fire spread quickly. We ran, the cabin consumed in an inferno behind us. When we reached the edge of the forest, I collapsed to my knees, tears streaming down my face. For the first time in weeks, I felt free. It's been a year since Black Hollow. The nightmares still come sometimes, and I avoid mirrors whenever I can. But the haunting has stopped. I destroyed her doorway, and with it, her power. Or so I hope. Because sometimes when I pass a reflective surface, I think I see a flicker of movement, a shadow that isn't mine, and I can't help but wonder if she's still out there, waiting for another chance. My name is Daniel Rhodes, and I've spent most of my adult life hiking and camping in remote wilderness areas. It's not just a hobby, it's an escape. There's something profoundly calming about being alone in the woods, far from the noise of the city. Or at least, that's how it used to feel. Before the Whispering Stones. It started with a trip to the High Ridge Forest, a sprawling stretch of dense trees and jagged cliffs that few dared to explore. I'd heard about it from a fellow hiker who mentioned strange rock formations deep in the forest, formations that locals avoided. People say they hear voices near them, he said with a nervous laugh. Probably just the wind, right? I wasn't superstitious, and the thought of something eerie intrigued me more than it scared me. So, armed with a map, supplies, and my ever-present curiosity, I set out to find these mysterious stones. The trail was overgrown and barely visible, as if nature itself was trying to keep people away. By the second day, I was deep into the forest, surrounded by towering pines and thick underbrush. The air was unusually still, and even the birds seemed reluctant to sing. That evening, I set up camp near a small creek. As the fire crackled, I studied my map, trying to pinpoint the location of the stones. The forest felt unnervingly silent, as though it were holding its breath. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me and turned in for the night. The first strange occurrence happened just before dawn. I woke to a faint murmuring, like a distant conversation carried on the wind. My tent was zipped shut, and I couldn't see outside, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaky. The murmurs stopped instantly, leaving behind an oppressive silence. I told myself it was just the creek, or the wind rustling the leaves, but deep down, I wasn't convinced. The next morning, I packed up and pressed on, determined to find the stones and put this unease behind me. The further I went, the stranger the forest became. Trees grew twisted, their trunks gnarled and their branches clawing at the sky. The air felt heavier, as though the forest were watching me. By midday, I found them, the Whispering Stones. They were larger than I'd imagined, massive monoliths arranged in a rough circle in the middle of a clearing. The stones were covered in strange carvings, symbols and patterns that didn't resemble any language I knew. Standing in their presence, I felt an almost magnetic pull. It was as though the stones were alive, humming with an energy I couldn't explain. The air was colder here, and the forest was unnervingly quiet. As I approached the stones, the murmuring started again, faint but unmistakable. It was low and rhythmic, like a chant in a language I didn't understand. My heart pounded, but I couldn't stop myself from stepping closer. I reached out and touched one of the stones. The moment my fingers brushed the cold, rough surface, the whispers grew louder. It wasn't just a noise, it was a presence, pressing against my mind, demanding to be let in. I stumbled back, gasping for air. The whispers receded, but the oppressive feeling remained. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but my curiosity held me in place. I pulled out my camera and began taking photos of the stones and their carvings, hoping to make sense of them later. That night, I camped just outside the clearing. I didn't dare sleep near the stones, but even at a distance, I could feel their presence. The whispers returned as soon as darkness fell, louder this time, their cadence more insistent. I tried to block them out, covering my ears and telling myself it was just the wind. But it wasn't the wind. The voices seemed to come from inside my head, overlapping and swirling, each one speaking in a different tone, some urgent, some mournful. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because I woke to find myself standing outside my tent, shivering in the cold night air. I had no memory of leaving my sleeping bag. My flashlight was in my hand, Its beam pointed toward the stones. They were glowing. A faint, pulsing light emanated from the carvings, casting eerie shadows across the clearing. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The whispers grew deafening, their words no longer unintelligible. "Join us," they said. "Become one with the forest." I don't remember how I made it through the night. When the sun rose, the light from the stones vanished, and the whispers faded into silence. I packed up my gear in a frenzy, determined to get as far away from that place as possible. But the forest wouldn't let me go. The trail I'd followed to reach the stones was gone, swallowed by the underbrush. Every path I took seemed to lead me back to the clearing. The stones loomed in the distance, unyielding, as if mocking my attempts to escape. Desperation set in. I stopped caring about the map or the trail, hacking my way through the forest in a blind panic. Hours turned into days, and I began to lose track of time. My food ran out, and my water bottle was nearly empty. The whispers were always there, faint but persistent, growing louder whenever I tried to sleep. They spoke of ancient rites and forgotten gods, of sacrifices made to bind the forest to its will. And always they called to me, "Join us." On the third night, I saw them, the figures. Shadowy and indistinct, they moved among the trees, their glowing eyes fixed on me. They didn't speak, but their presence was enough to freeze me in place. They surrounded my camp, watching, waiting. I don't know what drove me to do it, but in a moment of clarity, I reached into my pack and pulled out my camera. I took photo after photo, the flash lighting up the dark forest. The figures recoiled, their eyes narrowing into slits. One by one, they melted back into the shadows. The whispers faded, replaced by the normal sounds of the forest. Rustling leaves, distant bird calls, the bubbling of a creek. The spell was broken. When morning came, I found the trail again. My legs were weak, my body aching, but I forced myself to keep moving. By the time I reached my car, I was barely holding it together. Back home, I developed the photos. Most of them were blurry, indistinct, but one stood out. A clear image of the stones glowing in the darkness, and a figure standing among them. It was humanoid, but its proportions were wrong. Too tall, its limbs too long, its face featureless except for those glowing eyes. I deleted the photo and shoved the memory card into a drawer, unwilling to look at it again. I tried to tell myself it was over, that I was safe, but the whispers followed me. Even now, in the safety of my apartment, I hear them sometimes, faint but insistent. They're waiting, calling me back to the forest. Join us. I was never one for small towns, but after the breakup I needed to escape the noise of the city. Willowstead seemed like the perfect place, a quaint, quiet village tucked away in the mountains, known for its lush forests and serene lakes. What I didn't know was that Willowstead harbored a secret, one that I would come to know far too well. It started with the whispers about the old lighthouse. It wasn't near the ocean, but rather perched on the edge of Willowstead Lake, an enormous, misty expanse surrounded by dense pine trees. The townsfolk avoided it, crossing themselves when it was mentioned, muttering warnings to anyone curious enough to ask. "Best leave the lantern keeper be," an old shopkeeper told me one morning when I'd asked about the lighthouse's history. "He doesn't take kindly to visitors." "The lantern keeper?" I asked, intrigued. The shopkeeper just shook his head and refused to say more. That night, curiosity got the better of me. Armed with a flashlight and the kind of hubris that only a newcomer could have, I decided to visit the lighthouse. It wasn't hard to find. Its dark silhouette stood stark against the silver surface of the lake, its beacon unlit. The closer I got, the heavier the air seemed to grow, as if the atmosphere itself was warning me to turn back. The trees loomed over the narrow path, their branches creaking softly in the wind. By the time I reached the lighthouse, the sky had clouded over, casting the area in a strange, dim twilight. The lighthouse was taller than I'd expected, its white paint peeling and its windows grimy. The door was slightly ajar, as though someone had left in a hurry. I hesitated, flashlight in hand, but then I heard it, a low, rhythmic hum coming from inside. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air smelled of salt and mildew, and the wooden floor creaked under my boots. The hum was louder here, coming from somewhere above me. Against my better judgment, I began to climb the spiral staircase, my flashlight casting shifting shadows on the walls. As I ascended, I noticed strange carvings on the wooden beams, symbols I didn't recognize, intricate and jagged, like the scratchings of a madman. The hum grew louder, more distorted, and with it came a low vibration that I could feel in my bones. When I reached the top, I found the source of the sound. The lantern room was empty, save for an old oil lamp sitting on a rusted metal stand. The hum emanated from the lamp, its glass glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. I reached out to touch it, and the moment my fingers brushed the cold glass, everything changed. The room plunged into darkness, and the air grew icy cold. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving me standing in complete blackness. Then, from somewhere behind me, came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. "Who dares disturb the light?" a voice rasped, low and guttural, sending shivers down my spine. I turned, my heart pounding, but I couldn't see anything. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and then I saw him, the lantern keeper. He stepped into the dim glow of the lamp, his figure tall and skeletal. His face was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and his coat was tattered and soaked, as though he'd just emerged from the lake. In his gloved hand, he held a lantern, its flame burning a sickly green. "This place is not for you," he said, his voice like the groan of an old ship. "Leave now, or join the light forever." I tried to respond, to explain that I hadn't meant to intrude, but my throat was dry, and no sound came out. The lantern keeper raised his lantern, and the green flame flared, filling the room with an eerie glow. Shadows danced on the walls, twisting and writhing like living things. "You've seen too much," he said, his tone colder now. "The light knows your name." I don't remember how I got out of the lighthouse. One moment I was standing in the lantern room, frozen with terror. The next I was stumbling down the path, the lantern keeper's rasping voice echoing in my ears. "The light will find you." When I reached my cabin, I locked the doors and drew the curtains, my hands trembling. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the lantern keeper was some local legend brought to life by the isolation of the woods. But the next morning, I found a message scratched into my cabin door. "The light remembers." The days that followed were a blur of paranoia and sleepless nights. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the green flame, felt its unnatural heat. I started noticing strange things, shadows moving where they shouldn't, a faint hum that seemed to follow me wherever I went. At first I thought it was in my head, but then others began to notice too. "You look pale," the shopkeeper said one day, his brow furrowed. "Are you sleeping?" "Not really," I admitted. "It's nothing." He gave me a long, searching look. "You went to the lighthouse, didn't you?" I didn't respond, but the look on my face must have been answer enough. "You fool," he muttered, shaking his head. "You've brought it upon yourself. The lantern keeper doesn't let go easily." "What does he want?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The shopkeeper sighed. "The light is his prison. It feeds on souls, traps them in its glow. You've seen it, so now it hungers for you." That night, the hum grew louder. I barricaded myself in my cabin, but it was no use. The light seeped through the cracks in the walls, a faint green glow that pulsed like a heartbeat. I could hear the lantern keeper's voice, faint but insistent, whispering my name. I knew I couldn't stay. With what little courage I had left, I grabbed my car keys and fled, driving as far and as fast as I could. But no matter where I went, the light followed. It was in the street lamps, the headlights of passing cars, the glow of my phone screen. I haven't stopped running. I don't know if I ever can. The lantern keeper's words haunt me every night. The light remembers.